ではパネリストの皆様をご紹介したいと思います。最初に今日基調講演をお願いいたします。ドイツ連邦下院議員でいらっしゃいまして、NATO 議員会議の会長でもいらっしゃいますカール・ラマーズさんでいらっしゃいます。はい、そしてそのお隣参りましょう。NATO 国防大学研究部長のカール・ハインツ・カンプさんです。そしてそのお隣参ります。NATO 事務局新規安全保障課題局エネルギー安全保障課長、ミヒャエル・ルーレさんでいらっしゃいます。はい、そして、そのお隣が東京財団研究員、そして、防衛省防衛研究所地域研究部主任研究員の鶴岡路人研究員です。はい、で最後、渡部恒雄、東京財団上席研究員兼政策研究の外交安全保障担当ディレクターでございます。今お名前だけを簡単に申し上げましたが、今日の基調講演者でありますカール・ラマーズ議員について少しご紹介をいたします。お手元に日本語と英語でご紹介があるかと思いますので、詳しくはそちらをご覧くださいませ。1994年からドイツ連邦下院議員を務められまして、一貫して防衛委員会に所属、2006年からはドイツ連邦の、防衛委員会副委員長を務めていらっしゃいます。現在ももちろんそうです。そして1998年からNATO 議員会議にドイツの代表団として参加されまして、いろいろな要職を歴任され、2010年からNATO の議員会議の会長を務めておられます。2009年に一度日本にいらしたことがあるということでしたが、いわゆるしっかりと日本の、なんていうんですかね、しっかりと来日といいますか、ちょっとだけではなくて割としっかりと滞在するのは今回が初めてというふうにおっしゃっていらっしゃいました。そのお隣カンプさんについても簡単にご紹介いたします。はい、ドイツ外交評議会、そしてハーバード大学科学国際関係研究所などを経て、1988年からコンラート・アデナウアー財団にいらっしゃいます。オルブライト元米国務長官が座長を務めました NATO の新戦略概念を検討する専門家グループでアドバイザーなどを務めていらっしゃいます。そして現在は NATO 国防大学の研究部長ということですね。はい、そしてその他のリューレイさんに参ります。リューレイさんは1991年から NATO 事務局ずっと一貫して要職に就いていらっしゃいます。はい、政策企画部の次長、そしてスピーチライター課長等を経て、2010年から、新規安全保障課題局のエネルギー安全保障課長を務めていらっしゃいます。はい、それでは大体のご紹介が終わったところで、マイクを今日のモデレーター渡辺研究員に渡しまして、実際のセッションに入っていきたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
渡辺でございます。今日は本当にいい議論を皆さんとさせていただいたんですが、それとそのエッセンスも含めまして皆さんとその内容を共有できればと思いますが、最初にですねラマーズさんに基調講演をしていただくわけですが、大体普通の人はですね、よっぽどの専門家じゃない限りはNATO の議員会議とは何か、議員会一体それはどういう意味が持つのかと。実際ラマーズさんというのは2つのヘッドが、つまりドイツの議員であるとともに NATO の議員会議の2つの働きをしていて、それも非常に日本人には全く馴染みのない話なので、スピーチの前にですね鶴岡さんの方からちょっと説明をしてもらって、それでラマーズさんに話してもらうと、これが非常にいいのではないかと思っておりますので、鶴岡さん早速ですね説明をお願いします。
どうも鶴岡でございます。この NATO の議員会議というのは、そもそも日本語も締約があるのか実はわからないところもあるんですけれども、この NATO パーラメンタリーアセンブリーといいまして、略称としては NATOPA というふうに呼んでおります。でこれはじゃあ NATO の議員会議っていうのがどこにあるんですかとか、あるいはそういうものがあるんですかというふうに思われる方多いと思うんですが、実はこれは各国の国会議員が、その本職は各国の国会議員でありながら、年に何回か集まってですね、各国の国会議員の中で NATO に関心ある人、あるいはその防衛安全保障に関係している人が集まって会議をする枠組みということになります。これ実は1955年からありまして、非常に歴史のある枠組みです。で今は春と秋に全体会合をやっておりまして、それ以外にさまざまな小さな会議等もやっております。でこの NATO にとってどうしてこの議員、各国の国会というものを巻き込むのが必要なのか、重要なのかという点でございます。でこれはやはりその NATO というのが民主主義国家の同盟であると。でそうであるからには、安全保障政策、防衛政策を考える上では、どうしても国会議員の理解と協力、参加が必要であると、そういった認識に基づくものであります。で特にですね、ここ数年のことを考えてみますと、アフガニスタン、例えばですね、アフガニスタンのその各国が兵隊を出すマンデートの更新というのは、これほとんどの国で国会が認める認めないという議論をするわけですね。あるいは最近金融危機、財政危機の債務危機の中で国防予算、これもNATO 民主主義国の集まりですから、各国の議会というのが最終的に防衛予算、国防予算の決定権を持っているわけであります。ですからそういったアフガニスタンの文脈、あるいは国防予算の文脈というところで、その議員、各国の国会の果たす役割というのは非常に大きくなってきているわけです。だからこそその NATO を考える上で、その各国の議会とのリンケージというものが重要になってきているわけです。であと最後にもう一点だけ、その日本との関係というところでして、実は日本に日米欧総合安全保障議員協議会という議連のような組織がありまして、これは超党派の議連です。でここが NATOPA のカウンターパートとして機能しておりまして、NATOPA の総会に日本から代表団を数名派遣しているという実績もございます。ですから日本はそのオブザーバーとして、これはかなりもう長く参加をしております。ですからその日本にとっても実は非常にこれまでにも接点があった組織ということになります。ただもちろんその NATOPA というのはその NATO の組織ではありません。でその独立した存在なわけですけれども、NATO の活動を見ていく上で、その議会の役割というものにもぜひ注目していただければと思います。以上です。
鶴岡さんありがとうございました。鶴岡さんには後でコメントももらいますが、NATO というのは今日の議論でもいくつか出たんですが、軍事機構であると同時に政治の調整機構でもあるんですね。軍事と政治、これは切っても切り離せないものなんですが、民主主義国家ですからきちんとしたそういう過程があるということで、これは大変日本の同盟の今の在り方とかを考える上でも大変勉強になると思います。それでは早速ラマーズさんの方から基調講演をお願いしたいと思います。ポディウムの方でよろしくお願いします。
こんにちは。美しい国日本に来られて嬉しいです。Mr. President Akiyama, Mr. President Wolf, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very much delighted to be here today and to have the chance to talk to you about political challenges for security, NATO and Japan. Thank you very much for giving me this great opportunity. And thank you, the organizers, who led us together here. You, Mr. President, the President of the Tokyo Foundation, Mr. Masahiro Akihima, and Mr. Wolf, the President of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and all your staff. Thank you for organizing this event. Ladies and gentlemen, a Japanese proverb says, "With a friend at your side, no road seems too long." In my opinion, this reflects quite well the relationship between NATO and its partners, and of course, especially between Japan and NATO. Only recently, Japan has played a major role for NATO while hosting the Tokyo Conference on Afghanistan. This conference paved the way for a sustainable development of the country. After 2002, when Japan hosted the International Conference on Reconstruction of Assistance to Afghanistan, the country showed once again its great importance for NATO. For the Atlantic Alliance, partnerships have a special meaning. During the past 2 decades, the alliance has developed a network of partners across the globe. During the past 2 summits, in Lisbon in November 2010, in Chicago just a few weeks ago in May 2012, NATO started to reform this partnership policy. I had the honor to attend both summits as president of NATO Parliamentary Assembly. In the new strategic concept, which was adopted in Lisbon on November 19, 2010, cooperative security is one of the 3 essential core tasks of the alliance. The heads of state and government declared that NATO's partnerships can provide frameworks for political dialogue and regional cooperation in the field of security and defense, contribute to strengthening our common values, and are essential to the success of many of our operations and missions. This new strategic concept envisions a deepening of existing partnerships as well as dialogue with new partners. NATO wants to enhance partnerships through flexible formats that bring NATO and partners together. During the summit in Chicago, partnership policy also played a decisive role. For the first time, a meeting with 13 partners, Japan among them, that contribute to NATO-led operations took place. This meeting provided NATO with lessons learned and led to an exchange of views. NATO will continue to pursue its further implementation with a view to strengthening partnerships by reinforcing the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, the Mediterranean Dialogue, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, and relationships with partners across the globe, while making full use of flexible formats, further develop the political and practical cooperation, and through increasing partner involvement in training, education, and exercises. But it is not only NATO that is reforming its partnership policy, it is also Japan, as a partner itself, that is revising its policy. For the first time, NATO is mentioned in the National Defense Program guidelines from December 2010 as an organization the country is seeking to enhance cooperation with. Ladies and gentlemen, NATO's partnership policy was and still is, in my opinion, one of the biggest success stories of NATO. Without the partnership policy, the transformation after the end of the Cold War might have led into a totally different direction. Partnerships with countries from Middle and Eastern Europe helped to prevent the appearance of new dividing lines after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. And they made it possible to organize a NATO-led coalition that helped to keep peace on the Balkans. Many of these countries joined the 1994 established Partnership for Peace, which has been offering a program of practical bilateral cooperation. Partnerships were therefore a very important part of NATO's success in the 90s to stabilize the continent. And without partnership policy, NATO would not be able to find answers to the manifold security challenges of the 21st century. Today, partnerships are indispensable for NATO to assume its most important task, to ensure the security and stability of its members. The security environment has changed dramatically. Threats can emerge almost everywhere in the world and still affect our security. I think about threats like terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, piracy, or state failure. I think about new security challenges like cyber war, energy security, and environmental issues. Especially cyber attacks are, after terrorism and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, the third largest threat on our security. That is why I made it to one of my key priorities as President of NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And that is the reason why I visited 2 weeks ago the Cybercom in Baltimore, in Washington, as the biggest institution for fighting against cyber threats. There is also an international and financial crisis, you all know, which is challenging NATO and its members. We have to avoid that this financial crisis leads to a security crisis. To respond to this challenge, to ensure greater security for less money, we need to act together with more flexibility. Furthermore, the missions in Afghanistan and Libya, as well the developments in Northern Africa and the Middle East, have stressed the importance of partnerships for NATO. Beside those partnerships that are essential to sustain peace and security in the Euro-Atlantic region, NATO has, due to partnerships, the possibility to work on global security problems without becoming a global actor itself. In the conference before, I described NATO as a regional organization with a global horizon. Japan is not only one of those partners across the globe. It is in fact the oldest global partner of the alliance. Former Secretary General Hope Scheffer may have said it best. Japan, he said, is a country in Asia with which NATO has the longest standing relationship, a truly unique partner for the alliance in contributing to global security. There are good and manifold reasons for that. Even if there is a huge geographical distance between NATO members and Japan, both have a great deal in common. NATO and Japan share the same values. Values like democracy, freedom, rule of law, and human rights. Values on which NATO was built more than 60 years ago. Values which are more important now than ever before, but which are also endangered more than ever before. NATO and Japan have common strategic interests and a similar perspective on world security. As countries with modern economies and global interests, NATO members and Japan share the interest to develop cooperative approaches to emerging security challenges. NATO and Japan face the same security threats, like terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, piracy, cyber attacks. In the 21st century, threats are global. They can neither be stopped by several thousands of kilometers, nor by borders or continents. Only due enhanced cooperation it will be possible to address them. Japan is sensitized by several of those threats from its close neighborhood. One is the danger of nuclear and ballistic missiles from North Korea. This knowledge should be shared. Furthermore, NATO and Japan observe China's military build-up with sorrow. However, it is not only China. Especially in Asia, there are other new rising states which are in a period of transition. This might lead to instability in this region, which could affect both Japan as well as the Atlantic Alliance. In its latest defense strategy from January 2012, the United States, where I just come from, pointed out to lay the focus towards the Asia-Pacific region. This is not a strategy aiming against China, but a strategy which will ensure global security, which will be a contribution to more stability, I think, in this part of the world. And we as members of the NATO alliance, we appreciate that the United States as a global player concentrate more to this part of the world. This leads, in my opinion, to the conclusion that it is much better to work together to share the experience and knowledge than to act separately. Doing so, both Japan and NATO can learn a lot from each other and gain much. To make it quite clear, NATO is a friend of your country, and NATO is willing and ready to keep moving on the common path. Let me speak about the relationship and how it developed. The relationship between Japan and NATO has developed bit by bit in recent years. A first political dialogue started at the beginning of the 90s with the Japan-NATO Security Conference in Brussels, followed by a visit of the NATO Secretary General Manfred Wörner to Tokyo in 1991. But cooperation on concrete issues was the exception, not the rule. Things changed after the terrorist attacks from September 11. Common security interests have paved the way since then for an increased political engagement, for practical cooperation, as well as post-conflict cooperation. Where do we stand now? Political dialogue still is the main pillar of cooperation. A NATO-Japan security seminar has been institutionalized. Ministerial meetings and visits from high officials have expanded as well as official talks in the NATO headquarters. Japan is integrated into talks about almost all challenges of international security. With the decisions made during the Riga summit in 2006 to open partnership tools for contact countries, practical cooperation between NATO and Japan has regularly started. In 2007, a tailored cooperation packages with Japan was established, reaching from civil emergency planning, military to military exchanges, to the opportunity for Japanese military officers to study at the NATO Defense College in Rome. On the other hand, and on the other side, military contribution of Japan to NATO operations is very much limited. The reason for that is the Japanese constitution that only allows the defense of its own territory relating to Article 9. But this day and this afternoon, we heard that you think about what is possible under the umbrella and under the framework of your constitution, and we appreciate this very much. Despite those restrictions, Japan has contributed to various peace support operations all over the world. I remember the UN peacekeeping operation, the Golan Heights, election monitoring East Timor, UN stabilization mission in Haiti, UN mission in Somalia, and you have supported ISAF in Afghanistan in its best way possible without sending troops. Without Japan, and I will state this, especially the civilian reconstruction of the country wouldn't have been such successful. Japan is involved in a range of civilian projects in Afghanistan. Japanese aid workers are in the country to support the reconstruction of the country. As of May 2011, Japan has pledged $2.49 billion for the country. And only recently, Japan pledged further $3 billion in aid for Afghanistan through 2016 at the Tokyo conference on the reconstruction of Afghanistan. Thank you very much, and my respect for this great contribution to the development and to the situation in Afghanistan. That is great, and we all appreciate this. On November 12, 2011, a Japanese maritime patrol aircraft and a NATO warship worked together successfully in the Gulf of Aden and located and disarmed a pirate skiff. Let me very shortly speak about cooperation after Lisbon and Chicago. Cooperation has further increased after the decision of NATO made at the summit in Lisbon in November 2010 to reform the partnership policy with the goal to make dialogue and cooperation more inclusive, flexible, meaningful, and strategically oriented. A new partnership policy was endorsed in Berlin in April 2011 during a meeting of NATO foreign ministers. Under the so-called package, measures are being taken. But let me first state and quote NATO Secretary General Rasmussen when he said, "It was the goal to work on more issues with more partners in more ways." So, in the Berlin package, there is a streamlined NATO's partnership tools in order to open all cooperative activities and exercises to partners, including 1,600 activities. Better engage with partners across the globe. Build on improvements in NATO's training mechanism. Develop flexible formats. A first format took place in September 2011 when the NATO Council met with 19 partners, among them Japan, to discuss the challenges of piracy. A new meeting is planned according to cyber security. Ladies and gentlemen, we just listened to a great presentation, my dear colleague, of NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Yet it's true, this is a very important parliament, existing from 257 members of 28 member states, and totally 365 members with 14 countries, with 7 countries with observer status, among them Japan, 14 countries with associate status, and 4 from the Mediterranean area. We are not only a base for discussion, but we use the exchange of views. We use the opportunity to understand each other better. And I think it is very useful that the Secretary General always participates in our sessions, and vice versa, the President of NATO Parliament can participate in the NATO summit. So we make our contributions to more stability and security all over the world. And I use this opportunity here to thank especially your delegation, the delegation from Japan, which participates since 1980 in our sessions. This delegation is very present. They make great presentations, they make great contributions to our work, and so thank you very much to the members of the Diet, to the members of your Parliament, to the members of Parliamentary Assembly, and I very much enjoy to have a meeting with them tomorrow morning. Ladies and gentlemen, let me close with a few remarks. The current relationship between NATO and Japan is remarkable. Much has already been achieved during the past 2 decades, but I think we can do more. We can do more. NATO has revised its partnership policy during the past few months and years. Partnerships become more flexible in its practical cooperation. They will be deepened, and partner countries will be integrated into decision-making processes much earlier in the future. This will be very helpful for a future cooperation. And Japan, ladies and gentlemen, has also made a huge step forward in the updated National Defense Program, and I outlined before, NATO is mentioned for the first time as a country with which you try to cooperate more than ever before. Ladies and gentlemen, let me end with Henry Ford. He may have said it best when he said, "If everyone is moving forward together, then success takes care of itself." Arigatou gozaimasu.
ラーマーズさん、ありがとうございました。ダンケシン。 いよいよ、じゃあ、それ続きましてですね、2人のやはりNATO からのゲスト、これはもう席上からコメントをリマークをいただきたいと思います。最初はじゃあカンプさんの方からお願いします。
Okay, now it should go. So once again, thank you very much for this kind introduction. I very much appreciate that Mrs. Imai identified a person who is leading us out of this building should an earthquake occur. Simply because when I was last time in your beautiful city, it was on the very day of the earthquake, and I was sitting in my 23rd floor hotel room, and I was desperately waiting for someone leading me out, and no one came, so I'm much better off this time. Let me very shortly speak with you about 3 trends for NATO, developments, challenges, which will determine or influence NATO's future, and second, also 3 conclusions that have to be drawn from these 3 trends. Of course, there are more influencing trends and you can draw more conclusions, but since we are supposed only to speak for a few minutes, I will limit it to this. The first major trend for NATO, not only for NATO, is what the title of this presentation says, namely the financial crisis, not only in Europe, but worldwide. It is not the first financial crisis we have, but it is a financial crisis which is different from others. And there are 3 reasons why it is different. The first reason is the sheer magnitude. The sheer magnitude of this financial crisis, bigger than any other in the past. The second difference from other financial crises is that in NATO, for the first time, also the big countries, we call them the big spenders because they have bigger defense budgets, are significantly affected. This is new. And the third novelty is that the end of this financial crisis cannot be foreseen. And this is threatening. And when you read what happens in Europe right now, then the experts say that we have to wait for years, if not decades, until many countries will have a balanced budget again. Some people in the meantime speak about a new 30 years war that has to be fought on the economic front. And the consequences for NATO are quite simple. Namely, regardless what politicians say, regardless what meetings in whatever forum agree upon, we will face significant financial reductions in all NATO states, even in the United States, still as the biggest of the big spender. And this has another very important implication, namely that the military in NATO will even become more restrictive as they already are with regard to interventions. Military, contrary to what the movies say, are the most critical ones with regard to intervention because they know what it means to intervene with military force, and they will be even more critical. This has to do something with what we see in Syria right now and in other regions. The second major trend which affects NATO but also your region is the US reorientation of its strategic perspective more to this area, to the Asia-Pacific area. This is not negative for Europe. I think it's a normal consequence of the fact that we in Europe, lucky us, have much less unfinished business with regard to stability and security. And it makes a lot of sense for a global superpower to reorient itself to the region where there are the biggest challenges in the years to come. Still, the United States will be represented in both areas. Europe and Asia Pacific. Actually, 37,000 soldiers will remain in Europe. So therefore, the move of the United States is not a drama, but it certainly has implications for us Europeans, less attention, and for your Asia-Pacific region inhabitants, namely more attention. And it raises a very important question for NATO, namely, shall NATO remain very strong Eurocentric, or shall it also reorient itself towards this region, and do we have the capacities to do so? The third trend, which is probably not so important for you in this region, but very important for us because it's in our neighborhood, is what we call the Arab Spring, which in the meantime looks more like an Islamic winter. The problem is that although we welcome the Arab Spring, it has not led to what we were all hoping for, namely more stability in the region we call MENA, Middle East and Northern Africa. For many years to come, this region is to remain a crisis-prone region, and this has implications for NATO. Simply because NATO got engaged there in Libya, NATO even fought a war in Libya, which actually was a success. It was a success for three reasons. Because it first showed that NATO is the only institution that can act quickly with military means. Second, NATO has proven even more important that it can also end a conflict quickly without being caught in a mud. And third, it certainly has improved the image of NATO and the United States in the Arab world. For the first time, you did not see American flags burning, which usually get burned on a daily basis. But once again, the question is this NATO's role to get engaged in civil war in the Middle East? And what do we do now in Syria? And there will be more Syrias, probably. And in any crisis we have there, the question will come up, will NATO get engaged? And if yes, who is going to do what in NATO? The burden sharing question. Who is going to fight and who is going to watch? What are the consequences for all this? The first consequence is actually positive. Namely, the relevance of NATO is going to increase. Why? If all NATO countries, except the United States, have significantly cut their military, then even if the big spenders like the UK or France want to do a military operation, they are confronted with a question, which is either we do it in NATO or we don't do it at all. Which means NATO increasingly becomes the enabler or the facilitator for common military action. The only NATO member who can act militarily alone in future is the United States. For every other major operation, you need the alliance or the support of the alliance. The second consequence is that even if we act in NATO together militarily, still the burden sharing question remains. Who is going to do what? And there, the American policy in the recent years shows a change. In the past, the Europeans were always sure that whenever they acted militarily, the cavalry is going to come. It happened in Kosovo and elsewhere. Today, the United States have made very clear to their European allies, and I think it also holds true for the Asian allies, that in the wars of need, in those conflicts that have to be fought, the United States are at the side of their allies. We have an Article 5 in NATO which requires the support. So if we have an Article 5 case, if a NATO country gets attacked, NATO will be at its side because this is a war of need. But in all wars of choice, in stabilization missions in the neighborhood of Europe, the Americans might not be there. So we will have to look for a new model in NATO, and I think we have found one. The Libya operation was such a model. It was a war of choice, not a war of need. No one was attacked from NATO. The Americans did not lead, but they did support significantly. A very strong part of the operation was taken by the Europeans. Not always successful, but not that bad at the end of the day. So I think this is a model for the future, that we can count on US support, but Europe has to be capable to take on the brunt of any future operation. The third conclusion, the last one, already can echo what Mr. Lamas has said, that in such a world where we have challenges and less financial means, NATO needs partners. We have in NATO partners of need. Sometimes you need a partner, you know it from your business life. You might not particularly like, but he is necessary. And we have partners of choice. Those countries which for NATO have two criteria. The first criteria is they can deliver, they can support NATO militarily or like Japan with other means, very important. And second, they are politically like-minded. They tick like us. Because NATO is, at the end of the day, and Dr. Lamas has explained this, a value-based organization. So, to put it all in one last sentence, I think NATO is not, never was, and never will be a world policeman. Instead, it will be a regional defense alliance which has a global perspective, because globalization also holds true for security policy, which will be very close to its partners of choice, and this includes Japan, because this is the only way how we can secure stability in Europe, in the transatlantic realm, and also in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you very much.
カンプさんありがとうございました。それではもう続きましてですね、リューレさんの方からやはりリマークをいただきたいと思います。お願いします。
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. This is my first visit to Japan, so I have not experienced an earthquake like my friend Karl Heinz, but I had my own catastrophic experience involving Japan. In 1995, I was asked to write a dinner speech for the Secretary General of NATO who would come to Tokyo. And I thought I had written the best dinner speech of all time because it involved a wonderful, charming story about two Japanese frogs. It was a children's story. I give it to my boss, who was an American diplomat at the time. And he looks at this story and he says, it's a very nice story, perfect for a dinner speech. But is it really a Japanese story? Because we got it from a British children's book. I said it doesn't matter whether it is a Japanese story, and the Japanese audience will like it because it contains a lot of nice ideas about Japan and NATO. And he said, we have to verify whether this is a Japanese story. He was obviously very insecure. So we found a Japanese diplomat in Brussels at NATO, and we gave him the story. And we said, is this a Japanese story? And he was a diplomat, so he was not sure what he should answer. You know, what would we like? If he says yes, maybe it's the wrong answer. So he said, I don't read children's books, you know. So we finally decided we could not verify whether it was a truly Japanese story, and so we never used it. So the best speech I ever wrote is still somewhere in my archive in NATO, and Tokyo is missing the best speech. But I realized then that writing speeches for Tokyo is not a good idea. I should come here myself and deliver one. So thank you for having me here. My subject is cyber and proliferation in the Asian context. And let me start by saying that, of course, you all know that NATO today acts essentially globally. When you hear NATO, you think of Afghanistan. Last year, the Libya operation. We are in counter-piracy operations in the Indian Ocean. So NATO today is very much active on various continents. but I don't think that NATO has developed a truly global mindset. When it comes to thinking about security, despite Afghanistan, NATO is still very Eurocentric. And there are even people now who say that after the withdrawal of combat forces from Afghanistan in 2014, NATO will somehow have to come home. Now, it is true that after 2014, there may be no major NATO-led operation anywhere, although one never knows what comes next. It is also true, and my friend Karl-Heinz just mentioned this, that the financial crisis will constrain the defense budgets of NATO and therefore will also constrain the level of ambition of NATO. But I would argue that despite these constraints, I believe that NATO is going to develop a global mindset. I believe we are condemned to develop a global mindset. Why? And let me give you 3 reasons why. The first, of course, is the nature of security challenges today. They are global in nature. They do not respect borders. They are not national in the traditional sense. Cyber attacks, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism are typical examples. These threats represent the darker side of globalization. And because globalization is irreversible, these threats will be with us for a long, long time to come. Just these past weeks, we heard about new computer malware infecting both computers of industry and private computers. And just yesterday, speculation rose again about the potential use of chemical weapons in Syria. So clearly, we are in a very topical area here. And I think there are many more surprises that globalization has in store for us. The second reason why NATO has to develop a global mindset is NATO's partnership network. As has already been pointed out by the 2 previous speakers, NATO's relations with non-NATO countries are getting increasingly global. And this means that NATO will be increasingly exposed to the security concerns of its partner countries. Here in Japan, cyber and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction are, of course, among the top of the list. The third reason why NATO has to think globally is the United States shift to Asia that Karl-Heinz has already commented about. This shift does not mean that NATO itself will shift to Asia, but it means that the European allies will need to take a closer look at Asian security developments as well. And once they do that, they will become more conscious of the fact that Asia is not just a vast region with vast economic opportunities, but that there are also real hard security problems that need to be solved. Now, since cyber defense and non-proliferation are global developments, NATO can only be one part of a much more comprehensive answer. I think this goes without saying. But NATO has a number of features, a number of characteristics that makes it a very valuable contributor to global efforts to address these threats. NATO brings in the United States and Canada, and it brings in most of Europe, including countries that do not belong to the European Union, like Turkey. NATO has a very elaborate system of sharing intelligence, and that includes global issues like proliferation. And NATO has a full range of other tools that can be very helpful in looking at challenges like cyber defense and non-proliferation. We have a consultation process that is permanent. We meet every day at NATO. We have political decision-making. We have efforts to standardize equipment and procedures and doctrines and strategies. We have a military planning process that is multinational and more than 60 years old, so very well established. We have defense planning. And we have, of course, collective military operations if they are required. So all these instruments can be applied, can be brought to bear in cyber defense and non-proliferation. Very briefly, what do we do on cyber defense? Just in a telegram style, we are centralizing all cyber defense efforts in NATO under one authority. We are integrating cyber defense into our defense planning so that all allies are part of it. We are setting standards for cyber defense so that some nations do not have less protection than others. We are working much more strongly now with the private sector, with the information technology sector. And we are also seeking to work more with those partners that we trust most. Cyber is a matter very much based on trust. Japan is one of these partner countries that we seek to work with. On non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, what do we do there? Again, intelligence sharing, of course, is very, very crucial. We also look at ways to contribute to global arms control regimes, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for example. We are looking into how to defend ourselves if weapons of mass destruction are being used against our societies. So we need to look into how do we minimize the damage that this may cause. This brings me to the next issue, missile defense. NATO, like Japan, is investing more in missile defense because some issues some threats cannot be deterred, and we have to contemplate the fact that we need to defend ourselves. Nuclear deterrence is an important part of non-proliferation because nuclear deterrence deals with those cases where non-proliferation has failed and other countries acquire nuclear weapons. So nuclear deterrence is an important part of the equation as well. And NATO has said that as long as nuclear weapons exist in the world, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. And then finally, cooperation and consultation with partner countries on non-proliferation. Japan is in fact quite active when it comes to dealing with NATO on non-proliferation issues. We have had consultations, for example, on North Korea in the NATO framework, and we have annual major events, brainstormings, if you will, on how to strengthen non-proliferation, and Japan has been part of every of these meetings. So we are already very much interacting in this respect. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just conclude by saying that just a few weeks ago, NATO and Australia signed a political declaration about their future cooperation. That, to me, is a very clear sign that NATO's relations with partner countries in the Asia-Pacific region are becoming closer, and we define them better. I personally would very much hope that Japan would welcome such a development, more interaction with NATO, and I would also hope that Japan will eventually follow the example of Australia. So, in sum, I would say that the stage is set for more consultation and more cooperation between Japan and a NATO that looks more towards Asia. Thank you very much.
リュールさんありがとうございました。ぜひその幻のスピーチも聞いてみたいなと思いましたが、それでは鶴岡さんの方から日本側からのコメントとしてお願いします。
鶴岡でございます。すでに3人のゲストの方々が非常にいろいろなトピックをカバーしていただきました。で、私の方からその日本の視点からいくつかフォローアップ的なコメントをさせていただきたいと思います。で、一つはヨーロッパにとってのアジアの安全保障という観点であります。と申しますのも、その日本と NATO の話というふうにしますと、どうしてもその日本とヨーロッパは非常に地理的にも遠いし、ヨーロッパもあまり日本に関心ないだろうし、日本もあまりヨーロッパに関心ないと、そのように思われる方非常に多いと思います。ただ ヨーロッパがアジアの安全保障政治問題に関心を高めているというのは、これは極めて明確な現実、事実であろうと思います。で、その最大の要因は、その世界のそのパワーセンターが東から西へというふうに、最近よくパワーシフトと言われていますけれども、それが当然の一番大きな前提としてあるわけです。ただこれをもうちょっと具体的に考えてみますと、第1点目はやはりそのヨーロッパとアジアとの経済関係が拡大していく中で、当然その経済関係を守るため、経済的利益を守るためにもアジアの安全保障状況に注目せざるを得ない、考慮せざるを得ないということが一つあるわけです。でもう一つはすでにカンプさんもリューレさん、あるいはラマスさんのお話にもありましたように、まさにアメリカのアジア太平洋へのリバランシングと。でヨーロッパにとってアメリカというのは最大の同盟国でありまして、その同盟国の戦略的関心が移動しているとしたら、当然ヨーロッパ諸国としてもそれを関心を持たざるを得ないと。これもまたある意味自明のことであろうかと思います。で、そういった結果として一つ出てきている、ヨーロッパで出てきている認識というのはですね、やはりそのアジアの安全保障がヨーロッパに影響を与えるかもしれない、そしてまた影響を与える度合いがより今後増えていくんだろうということ、この認識が非常に高まっているということだと思います。でこれはヨーロッパから見るとアメリカがアジアに関心を持ってくれてアジアはいいですねという話になりがちなんですけれども、これはまさにカンプさん先ほどおっしゃられたようにですね、問題がいろいろ残っている、あるいは難しい問題がたくさんアジアにはあると。だからこそアメリカは注目せざるを得ないわけで、別に好きで注目しているわけではないと言えるんだと思うんですね。ですからそういった中でヨーロッパへのアジアの安全保障への関心は高まっているということだろうと思います。でもう次に日本と NATO との関係で、まさにラマス会長指摘されたように、もっともっといろいろできるはずであると。これは私も非常に賛成でありまして、もっといろいろできるんだろうと思います。でここでやはり一つ注目しなければいけないのは、お三方いろいろな課題を挙げていただきましたけれども、特にその NATO の文脈で NATO が抱えている課題として、そのアメリカとのバードンシェアリングの問題、あるいは国防予算の問題、いろいろありましたけれども、これもうそのまま日本に当てはまる部分って非常に大きいんだと思うんですね。ですからまさにその似たような課題を NATO と日本が抱えているということ、そしてまさに今回の東京財団フォーラムの英語の方のタイトルがですね、Addressing Common Security Challenges ということで、まさに共通の安全保障の挑戦に対して取り組むということでありまして、これは地理的に離れているというようなことをもう議論している時代ではないんだろうと思うんですね。それはまさに先ほどリューレさんの指摘された、例えばサイバーなんかですと地理的に離れているというのは全く意味をなさないわけですね。ですからそこでそのグローバリゼーションのこのマインドセットをどのように新しく作っていくかということなんだろうと思います。で最後にさまざまなまさにコモンセキュリティチャレンジと、その共通の課題があるということなんですけれども、もうちょっと実際に行われていることというのも実はあんまり日本で意識されていないんで若干触れたいと思います。と申しますのは、日本の自衛隊はもちろんアフガニスタン ISAF には参加していないわけですけれども、だからといってヨーロッパ諸国の軍隊と日本の自衛隊との間に接点がないということでは全くないわけであります。例えばイラクですけれども、これは日米協力だと思って自衛隊はイラク行ったわけですけれども、イラク行ってみるとですね、サマワの治安を担当していたのはイギリスですし、その後はオランダだったわけで、まさに海外に出れば隣にいるのはヨーロッパだというのが現実なんですね。でもう一つ今アデン湾でやっております海賊対処の活動、これに関しても例えばジブチに日本は哨戒機を置いていますけれども、そこで隣にいるのは EU の部隊であったりするわけです。でまた海賊対処をやっていく中では NATO の部隊との接点というのもたくさんあるわけです。ですから別に日本が ISAF に参加していないからといって接点がないわけではなくて、日本が海外に行く、そしてまた日本が海外にエンゲージすればするほど隣にいるのはヨーロッパであって、ヨーロッパとの協力というのは現に進んでいると いうことであります。そして最後に1点、ラマスさんも強調されましたけれども、まさにこの価値という側面でありまして、どうしてヨーロッパなのかと、ヨーロッパ以外でもいいわけでありますけれども、皆さん世界地図を見ていただくと分かりますように、価値という観点で価値を共有する国というのを世界地図の中で探してみるとですね、当然オーストラリアとかニュージーランド、韓国といったようなアジア太平洋の地域の国もあるわけですけれども、数的に多くは北米でありヨーロッパにあるんですね。で、北米でありヨーロッパであるということを考えると、これは多くはNATO の加盟国なわけですね。ですから日本とヨーロッパがそういった面で協力するというのは別に何も突飛なことではなくて、世界の現実としてある程度当然ということで、だからこそ日本とヨーロッパはナチュラルパートナー、自然なパートナーだというふうに言われることが多いんだろうと思います。私の方から以上です。ありがとうございました。
鶴岡さん、ありがとうございました。普通はこれでパネル同士とかの話をしたりもするんですが、今日はもうちょっと時間も迫ってますし、皆さんもいろいろお聞きしたいことも多いと思いますので、ここでフロアからの質問を受け付けたいと思います。それで通訳は英語でも日本語でもしなくちゃなりませんので、質問のある方は挙手いただいて、係員がマイク持ってきますので、マイク来るまで話さないでください。それからお名前とご所属をいただいて、それで質問をしていただければと思います。それではじゃあ早速手が後ろの方で挙げていただいた方がいるので、マイクに行きますので、ちょっとお待ちください。はい、
防衛大学の太田と申します。今NATO と日本の協力の件で一つ出てこなかった件で確認したいんですけれども、それは天安門事件以降ですね、対中武器エンバーゴをリフトするという動きがヨーロッパにあるというふうに理解しております。今中国は最新の兵器はやはりロシアから輸入している。しかしロシアも自分の脅威になるので、二流三流の武器しか中国に出してない。でそこでもしヨーロッパがですね、最新の武器を中国に輸出するということになってくると、ロシアもその武器産業を育成するために最新の武器を中国に売るということになると。でそれは極めて日本の国益にとって好ましくないというふうに思っておりますが、この件に関してですね、今の NATO の動きに関してお伺いしたいと思っています。以上です。
どなたかお答えいただく方いますか。じゃあルールさんいいですか。はい。
Thank you. This is an issue that we do not discuss in NATO because the arms embargo is an EU embargo, and therefore it involves in part the same nations. But NATO as such is it's a collection of sovereign nation states, and therefore these kinds of issues are usually not discussed. They are always in the room, but they are not formally discussed. We had a similar issue when France sold a ship to Russia, and the Georgians were very unhappy, and some other countries were very unhappy. But we do not use NATO for these kinds of discussions. Why? Because if we would burden the consultation process in NATO with these issues, I think we would quickly get into each other's hair, as we say, and this would, I think, deflect, or it would divert NATO from its core business, which is to keep allies together to address issues such as Afghanistan or others. So it's really an EU issue rather than a NATO issue. I'm sorry for this weak answer.
I can try it with a very personal point of view. Once again, not a NATO position, because as Michael said, it is not a NATO issue. But I think that, there have been efforts to lift this embargo for many, many years, from China itself, but also from many European countries who saw problems in their potential to export weapons. Still, it has been upheld for more than 25 years. So this in itself, I regard as a success. Whether at the end of the day you really prevent military modernization by such an embargo is questionable. But I think very personally, for the symbolic value at least, it was important to keep it up that long, and every day longer is better. But that's a very personal view. Thank you.
他に何かどなたかいますか。いませんね。じゃあまた次の質問は。それじゃあ今3列目の方手を挙げられた方います。もう一度手を挙げてください。マイクが分かるように。はい。
田島と申します。今日はありがとうございました。さっきリューレさんからミサイル防衛の話が出たんで、それに関連してロシアとの関係ちょっとお聞きしたいんですが、以前から NATO とロシアとはミサイル協力について話し合っておられると思うんですが、またシカゴのサミットでもロシアとは真の戦略的パートナーとなりたいというようなことも言っておられて、ロシアとの関係を非常に重視されているわけなんですが、最近EPAA、European Phased Adaptive Approach ですね、これに関して非常にロシアは強硬に反発している。したがって、今 NATO にとってはロシアとの関係っていうのは非常に大きな問題だと思うんですが、なかなか難しい問題と思うんですが、どうお考えになっているかなって現状、それちょっとお聞きしたいと思います。
じゃあまずリューレさん、じゃあ準備してみてください。
Thank you very much. Indeed, this is one of the contentious issues between NATO and Russia at this point. A couple of things. First, I don't think that Russia has a general problem with the first phases of the phased adaptive approach. They have a problem with the latter phases of that approach, when the system grows. And they want legal guarantees that the system does not affect their own nuclear deterrent. Now, legal guarantees are, I think, for good reason, are not feasible. You can't, because Russia can always define what affects them, and we cannot give a legal guarantee which is then interpreted by the other side. But what I think Russia has a legitimate, where Russia has a legitimate point, is transparency. Russia should see what we are doing and why we are doing it. And I believe that we have given a lot of indications that we are quite willing to be very transparent on this issue. One of the things that we do with Russia on missile defense is actually we cooperate on tactical missile defense for many, many years. So Russia already has a basic idea how we approach the issue. So I'm not, I can see why Russia is concerned, but it doesn't seem to me like a concern that cannot be addressed. At this stage, it seems that Russia is, in any case, waiting for the US elections before it makes any move. So I did not expect anything to happen this year. We have to see who wins the election, what happens in the United States, what happens after that. A general final point, as I said, we have to take Russia's perception seriously, and we are willing to do that. But at the same time, if I am developing a missile defense against global threats, I cannot hold my security hostage to perceptions of someone else who may have quite false perceptions. So if my priority is protection against ballistic missiles in an age of proliferation, I need to go forward. And I cannot let Russia decide on whether I should go forward or not. So a solution will be found. I think NATO will go forward, and I believe then Russia will find ways to accommodate.
This is on. Please let me add some few remarks to this question. I think we all agree that cooperation with Russia in the global framework is necessary. So I think it was a good signal from NATO on the summit in Lisbon, 19th of November 2010, to reset button. You know, that was the starting point for a new relationship. And then this was made, I very well remember, in Munich during the Munich Security Conference between the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Clinton, and Mr. Lavrov. But what has developed since then? I think it was the attempt to reduce the mistrust. We need Russia to solve some problems in the world, Afghanistan, Middle East. Now we see the blockade policy relating to Syria. And so I think that was a good starting point. And they tried to gain confidence from the Russians relating to that was Mr. Rühle just described missile defense. But there, and we recognize it more and more, there are two perceptions. And I think we have to do something more to come together. But one thing is right, that from our perspective as NATO, we go forward to Russia to win their trust, to win their confidence, as we say that is a system, missile defense, which we can defend us and protect us against common threats. And I think the Russians should be able to recognize it, that the future for them is also cooperation, not mistrust. There is no reason for that.
Might add one last sentence to this. I think Russia has to understand that regardless what NATO does with regard to missile defense, the United States will build up a missile defense. It is even a law in the United States, the Ballistic Missile Defense Act, which obliges every president to go on with the missile defense if, and this is the important sentence in the law, if technically feasible at bearable cost. So this is something which will definitely go on regardless how the cooperation with Russia will evolve.
ありがとうございました。それでは次の質問どうぞ。そうですね。でそちらが早かったからまずそちらとあとその次今お待ちください。次行きますので。
My name is Ken Ota. My question is to Heru Lamarz. Last year, U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said at the NATO headquarters, Americans are sick and tired of paying 50% of NATO annual due by America itself, and 23 out of 28 NATO countries are not even willing to pay their required 2% contribution. That's what he said in his last speech as a Secretary of Defense. My question is, as a president of the National NATO Parliamentary League, how do you persuade your remaining 23 other members willing to pay for their annual dues? And if that's not the case, how do you plan to fund the future of NATO? And secondly, in Japanese politics, there's an old famous idiom called focusing on national defense and foreign policy will not win neither votes nor contribution check. Is that different in the case of Deutschland politics? Thank you.
Genau. Weil sich ja Gates beschwert hat. Weil ja Gates die Rede gehalten hat.
Yes, it is a real problem, which you describe and explain. And I'm a German parliamentarian, and I think even Germany could do more. All countries could do more. But there is a crisis, a financial crisis, in all countries. I think in your country too. So we have not enough money to spend for security, but we have to do everything we are able to do to protect our people. I'm a member of German parliament in the region of Heidelberg, and the people ask me, what are you doing for our security? I don't think that spending money for military aspects is not very popular, but people want to be secure. And so that is a balance. I think we all have to do more. But if you have no money, if you have problems with the budget, you have to think of other opportunities to remain security for the people. And I think our answer is maybe not to spend more money we don't have, but to make a better policy. And that is smart defense. You have listened to that, what Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen has suggested. If you have not enough money to pay for everything as one country, you have to go together to cooperate, and that is by smart defense. That is an intelligent, smart policy by spending less money and to remain, I say, the same level of security. So we are doing this. That is my answer. That is my suggestion to all my parliamentarians in NATO Parliamentary Assembly and to my colleagues in German Bundestag. Not to cut more and more. That is not responsible. But to use the money you have, to put it together, to bundle your efforts, and by working together, by better cooperation, to remain, I hope, the same level of security in our countries.
ありがとうございました。じゃあ、カンプさんどうぞ。
I think Dr. Lammers is absolutely right. Simply because, and we were discussing this in the other forum already, just make a very simple calculation, and I'm not a military person. Take the budget of all NATO countries together and add the budgets of those countries which we regard as partners from NATO. Japan, Australia, New Zealand, many others. At the end, you come up to some between 75 and 80% of global military spending. This is what we spend. If this is not enough, then we do something wrong. And we do a lot wrong in duplications and in spending it not wisely. So if we take the pure sum of money, it is probably sufficient if we manage to agree on who does what. And I think in that sense, smart defense is one possible answer, not, by the way, a panacea, not a silver bullet, but one of the few ways we have. Thank you.
それではそろそろ時間になりましたので、最後の質問の方がいらっしゃいますが、あともしどなたかもうこれはっていうのがあれば一緒に質問を取ります。まず最初の方、質問の方にマイクを言ってください。
自衛隊 OB の徳田と申します。My question is addressed to カンプさん、ドクターカンプ。この1月にトランスアトランティックバーゲン、非常にいいペーパーをお出しになりました。これ皆さん読まれたと思います。そこで
Yes, I hope so.
NRF NATO Response Force、これが非常に重要であることを強調しておられます。でもこれは今年の1月の話です。ヨーロッパのエコノミッククライシスがさらに悪くなりました。そして確かにボスニアの時は NATO はよくいい仕事なさいましたが、今度は相手が中国です。そしてお金はありません。我々もありません。それでスマートディフェンスというのは非常にいい言葉ですが、金のないディフェンスの別名だと私たちリタイアドミリタリーは考えています。これ本当に深刻にどう考えておられますか。本当の話を聞きたいです。
はい、ありがとうございます。それでもう最後にも質問をじゃまとめますので、じゃあマイクこちらでお願いします。
安全保障機関理学会という学会のメンバーで吉川と申します。昨年の地震の時に日本は友達作戦でアメリカに非常に助けてもらいましたけれども、NATO はNATO 諸国およびそのパートナーオブザーバー、そういうところとそういう大量破壊武器の拡散防止、あるいはその自然災害、そういうものに関する合同の訓練を行うということをやっているのか、これからもやるという予定があるのか、これはそういう世界のお互いの理解を深めるという意味で非常に重要だと思うので、お考えを聞かせていただければと思います。
質問、じゃあ最後、じゃあこちらの女性の方で、これで最後にします。
Thank you so very much for your highly suggestive, provoking presentation. Thank you so much. Actually, I'm working on the cybersecurity on Japan side. So I would like to ask maybe Dr. Mihiael Rule, how would you see that Japan and NATO collaboration, the potential for the collaboration in the future or maybe currently? Thank you so much.
それではですね、もうこれ最後ですので、3つの質問をまとめて、皆さん、ファイナルリマークですので、最後に皆さんコメントをしてください。どなたからいきますか。
Let me start first with the China issue. I don't think that NATO defines China as a threat. NATO does not define any country as a threat. NATO is a defense alliance. It is a legitimate question of what is NATO actually defending. And the answer is that NATO defends three things. It defends the territory of its members. It defends the people in the territory, because for instance, terrorists go for people and not for certain regions. And third, and this is very important, NATO defends vital interests of its member states. I cannot see for the time being how a dispute with China or any other Asian country, except North Korea, should affect NATO's vital interests. So this is why NATO does not define neither a specific country, and particularly not China, as a threat. So if an attack should occur from any of these countries, then the situation is different. But for the time being, this is not the case. And even if I may add this one sentence, I was just saying that if, from a Chinese point of view, if you are opposed to an alliance of 28 countries plus many other partners, which covers between 75 and 80% of the global military expenditures, I think China is more concerned than NATO has to be.
それじゃあルーレさんお願いします。
Thank you. On the question on joint exercises, disaster response, there are indeed a number of joint exercises with many countries, NATO and partner countries. Just last year we had one major exercise in Moldova. After Fukushima, Japanese experts came to NATO to brief about the Japanese approach. So there is a regular discussion. And of course this can be continued, expanded. That depends very much on the interest of the partner country. So on this one, I think we are quite active. On the question of Japan-NATO cooperation on cyber, I think there are a number of areas. I'm not a cyber expert myself, but the first is, of course, to have a regular dialogue on the nature of cyber threats. Who is the major problem? What kind of methods do they use, and so forth. And the second point would be, I think, an exchange of experience. I don't just mean what experience do we have in being attacked. I'm thinking of the different national experiences in building up cyber defenses. What does it mean for the relationship between ministries, for example, defense ministry, domestic, interior ministry, and so forth? There are probably some very valuable lessons that NATO and vice versa Japan can learn in setting up a stronger cyber defense. And the third area would be comparing notes, or ideally coordinating positions when it comes to global regulatory frameworks. The fact that NATO was a participant as NATO to the London conference last year, Japan was there too. I think if we could have a regular dialogue on what kind of norms would we like to have. Now we are under no illusion that you can develop norms which then would prevent cyber attacks. That's impossible. I mean, we have norms against crime, and crime happens all the time. But it's important to have norms in order to establish responses. Norms are a tripwire. They are a threshold that gives you an idea how to respond to which breach of a norm. So having a common idea on what our favorite idea of a free cyberspace would be would tremendously enhance each other's legitimacy in making the case for a regulated cyberspace.
それじゃあ鶴岡さんお願いします。
はい、まず災害救援の話で、先ほどすでにリュウレさんからもお話ありましたけれども、これ NATO も非常に昔から もう50年代60年代からやっていることでして、で NATO の文脈ではシビル・イマージェンシー・プランニングという CEP という言い方をしてて、それが日本の災害救援にあたるものかと思いますけれども、ですからさまざまな教訓事項を共有するといったようなことは日本とNATO の間でもいろいろなものが可能なんではないかというふうに思っております。それとスマートディフェンスの話で結局お金がない人のディフェンスなんじゃないかと、まさにその通りの部分あるわけですけれども、NATO で言われているスマートディフェンスで、一番まず真っ先に言われるのがプーリング&シェアリングっていう言い方をしまして、多国間でいろんな国との間で物を共有したり一緒に使ったりというような話なわけですけれども、これをそのまま日本に適用するのはやはりなかなか環境が違いますので難しいと、これは一つ言えるわけですけれども、だからといって接点がないかといいますとそんなことは全くありませんで、NATO のスマートディフェンスでも一つの大きな柱になっているのがプライオリタイゼーションと、要するに優先順位を明確につけると、要するにお金があるときはいろんなものに使えるわけですけれども、お金ないときにはやはり優先順位をしっかりつけていくということ、これが一つと、あともう一つは多国間のマルチラテラルなプロジェクトであったり協力ということであります。でこの文脈でやはり日本も昨年の武器輸出三原則の実質的な緩和の話がありましたけれども、あれの目的の一つもやはり予算がなくなっていく中でどのようにして国内の防衛産業基盤を維持するかということでありますので、まさにNATO 諸国が抱えている問題と似ているところがあるんだろうと思います。ですからプライオリタイゼーションの優先順位の話と多国間の協力というのはまさに日本にとっても課題となるところだろうと思います。
ありがとうございます。会場の皆さん、すみません、終了時刻をオーバーしてて申し訳ないんですが、最後にラーマーズさんの方から最後にリマークお願いします。
Yeah, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank the Tokyo Foundation and you, Mr. President, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, you, Jörg Wolf, for organizing this, as I think, very important event. Japan is a great country based on the same values we share in NATO. We face the same challenges. So, cooperation is not only an option, it is, in my eyes, the only chance to master these challenges. We all want to live secure and free, and William von Humboldt said, without security, there is no freedom. So my conclusion is, let us enhance our cooperation to the benefit of us all. Thank you very much.
どうもありがとうございました。